Hello and welcome to configuring Oracle Network Environment practice. In this practice, we are going to create a new listener, create TNS names or network aliases, and configuring advanced connection options. As we discussed in the chapter, we can go with either Network Manager to configure network environment, netca, or Oracle Enterprise Manager network administration page to configure network environments. In this practice, we are going to use netmgr to configure the network environment. To access the tool, just open terminal, run ora env to set Oracle SID, Oracle Home, and the path pointing to Oracle Home /bin, providing your database name, in our case ORCL, type netmgr. So this is the Oracle Net Manager that we will use during this practice. Expand local. Here we have again three main categories. Profile, anything changed in the profile like encryption, tracing, like naming methods, like logging also can be changed from profile section. Anything changed in profile section will go to sqlnet.ora file. Service names here to define new aliases to connect to your database. A listener to define a new listener. Any changes you made in the service naming category will be saved to tnsnames.ora file. Anything changed to listeners category will also save to listeners or listener.ora file. So let's start by creating a new listener. Expand listeners category. So we have an existing listener which listening to default port which is 1521. The default listener has a name listener. So we will start by creating a new listener by click listener category or listeners category and then at the plus sign name the listener. We will name it as, for example, listener 2. At the listening locations we can define port of the listener, host name where the listener will be run, and the port of the listener. Click add listener. Here we can define the host name and the port of the listener. Protocol, keep it TCP IP. For the host, we'll check host name, confirm the host name. So this is our host, DB12C, it's okay. Port, we cannot use port 1521 because this listener is listening port 1521. So you cannot have two listeners listening on the same port. We can go with listener, for example, port 1522. There is a very important point here you have to take care about. In case your listener is listening, for example, to port 1522, 1523 and so on, not the default port which is 1521, you have to do something called static registration. Static registration means tell the listener what databases instances exist on this server. There is two types of registration. There is a dynamic registration and static registration. Dynamic registration happened automatically. There is no any configuration. As long as the database listener listening to port 1521, the database can automatically register with listener. This is called dynamic registration. Again, dynamic registration, the database can register itself with the listener as long as listener listening to port 1521. This is called dynamic registration. This is happened by process called or background process called listener registration process, LREG, which is part of the instance. As long as the listener is listening to port 1521, there is something called dynamic registration, which is the database will register itself with the listener listening to port 1521. If the listener is listening to non-default port, for example 1522 or 1523 and so on, the database cannot register itself with that listener. So the listener cannot know there is a database instance on this machine. So how we can let the listener knows about this database? By doing something called static registration. We can do static registration by two ways. Either by using a parameter at the database level called local_listener and specify the TNS name that connect to the listener, or by using the listener configuration file listener.ora. Here we will go with listener configuration file from the net manager. Under database services, you click add database, global database name for the database that you want this listener to listen to. Make sure the Oracle home is correct, and the SID make it small letter, not capital letter, in case you have a small letter SID. Once you finish, click 5, save configuration file, exit. Let's double check that the configuration happened by go to the /user1 app Oracle product to Oracle home. Again, network admin. This is the location of our network configuration files. Here we will have the listener.ora, SQL.ora, tnsnames.ora. So let's make sure our listener added to listener.ora file. So as we can see, this is the old listener default listener listening to port 1521. This is the new created listener, which is called listener2. This is the protocol, this is the host, this is port of the listener. This is the database that the listener listen to. This is called static registration. Because the listener is listening to port 1522, the database cannot register itself with the listener. So the listener will not be able to know what databases exist under this server. So this is called static registration. Static registration means there are two ways to do the static registration again. One, by using local_listener parameter at the database level or at the instance level, or the second way is by using listener.ora file by adding the database information at the listener.ora file. So listener2 knows about the database because we add entries about the database in the listener configuration at listener.ora file. So that way we do a static registration. Without doing a static registration, listener2 will not be able to listen to the database ORCL because the port of the listener is not default. Exit from the configuration file. When you add a listener using Net Manager, by default the listener is stopped, so you have to start it. To start the listener, we will use listener control utility to start the listener, lsnrctl, which stands for listener control. Listener.ctl has start, stop, status, and so on commands. We can go with the start. If you don't provide name of the listener, start will start the default listener, which is listener, that has a name listener. So listener.ctl start, if you try to do this way, it will give you an error because the listener is already started. As you can see here, is already started, because without providing the name of the listener, he will start the listener that has a name listener. So you have here to provide name of the listener, listener2 in our example. So as we can see, listener2 started listening to a database ORCL or instance ORCL. This is called static registration by adding an entry about the database to the listener.ora file. This is called static registration. Second part of the practice, we will use also netmgr or net manager to define a service name alias. Again, go to local. Here we can expand existing aliases. We have ORCL alias. ORCL alias. So in the alias, if you do, for example, TNS ping ORCL, it will be resolved to this host and this port, and this is the database or service name, database service name. We will add a new service name alias called ORCL2 that connect to the database using the second listener, listener2. So we will add a service name ORCL2, protocol TCP/IP, host name which is DB12C, port of the listener 1522, next, database service name is ORCL. Next, we can do test connection or test to the database by click on text and providing username and password. Here we can, because the Scott user is locked, we can change login and provide, for example, system user. Click OK. Test again. So the connection was successful. Close. Finish. So we have two TNS name aliases, one called ORCL and one called ORCL2. ORCL connect to the database using listener, which is 1521 port. ORCL2 connect to the database by using listener2, listening to 1522 port. Click file, save network configuration, exit. Let's do TNS ping for ORCL. TNS ping ORCL, this is the TNS name alias or net service alias. So it's resolved to connect descriptor, which is the protocol, TCP, host, port, and service name ORCL. DNS ping ORCL2, same thing but different port, which is 1521 by using listener 2. Let's view the tnsnames.ora file to see what entries stored in tnsnames.ora file. It should have two entries, ORCL and ORCL2. So ORCL2, this is the TNS name alias or net service alias. This is the connection descriptor. So when you do TNS ping ORCL or TNS ping ORCL2, this file will be used to resolve ORCL2 or ORCL2 the connect descriptor. So connect descriptor, which define the connection string to connect to the database. So this is the protocol. I need a protocol, host where the database exists, port where the listener is listening, and the database name or service name, and same thing for ORCL2. So let's try to connect to the database by using ORCL or ORCL2 SQL Plus. We will use local naming. Local naming means use the tnsnames.ora file on the local machine. This is called local naming. Or we can go with Easy Connect. Easy Connect does not need a configuration file. It does not need a tnsnames.ora file. We are providing the user password at the database server name, port of the listener, and database name. So that this is called Easy Connect. Or we can go with second listener ORCL. It's called Easy Connect. But in local naming, we have to provide a net service alias, for example ORCL. ORCL will be resolved to host, protocol, and service name. So we are connecting using listener 1. Here we are connecting using listener 2. If you stop the listener, ORCL, if you stop listener 2, for example, if you try to connect to the database using ORCL2, it will give you no listener, because ORCL2 will connect to the database through listener 2. It will give you no listener because listener 2 is down, as we can see. Start it again. So we have connected now using listener 2. The last part of the practice, we will use the advanced options for the network configuration. Again, netmgr. Here we will use create a new service name or the service name alias called, for example, ORCL advanced. Host name db12c, port 1521, DNS name or service name of the database ORCL. Finish. Here we have the first address, which is using the listener port 1521. We will add another address by using the second listener 1522. To define the advanced options like load balancing, connect time failover, and source routing, we can go with advanced options. In advanced options here we have 5 options to connect load balancing, failover, and source routing. Try each address in order until destination reach. This is called source routing. Try one address selected at random. This is called load balance. Try each address in order until one succeeds. This is called failover. Try each address randomly until one succeeds. This is called failover and load balance. You are using failover and load balance. The last one, which is disabling the feature, use only the first address. So we'll go with using failover and load balancing at the same time. Click OK. File, save configuration. So we have a service name alias orcl underscore adv that use 2 listeners. If the first listener is down, he tried to use the second listener. If the second listener is down, he will use the first listener randomly. This is load balance plus failover. This is mainly used in case you have, for example, a rack. So let's test the service alias by using SQL plus. Exit. Let's first DNS ping orcl underscore adv. So as we can see, orcl underscore adv TNS name alias resolved to 2 connection descriptor. The first one, which is using host db12c port 1521. The second address using db12c server database server and port 1521. As we can see here, load balance equal yes. Load balance equal yes. We can view tnsnames.ora file. This is load balance equal yes. As we can see here, there is no failover equal yes mentioned in the TNS name descriptor. Failover by default enable when you are using address list. Failover by default enable when you are using address underscore list, as we can see in the descriptor. Let us test our TNS name SQL plus system at oracle underscore for you at orcl underscore adv. So now I am connecting to the database. Let's try to stop one of the listeners, which is the listener listening to port 1521. lsnrctl status. So the listener is down. Let's try to connect. It should succeed because listener 2 still running. As you can see, it connects me to the database. Stop the second listener. Now the connection, if you try to connect, should fail because both listeners are down. No listener. Try to start, for example, listener 1. Connection succeeded when we start listener 1. So this is called advanced options, how to use load balancing and connect time failover using 2 addresses or using 2 listeners in our case. I hope this video was informative for you and thank you for watching.